We're looking at three key events that, frankly, force us to ask big questions about dissent, about power, and about where things are headed. And the core disagreement, I think, running through all of this is the current administration acting, appropriately? Are they responding to a real coordinated campaign to destabilize things? Or is the response itself an overreach, maybe even designed to shut down legitimate political opposition?
Look, our country is facing, I think, a domestic ideological war. It's a war on free speech. And the assassination of Charlie Kirk, it isn't just some random crime. It feels like the brutal, predictable endpoint of an unchecked, years-long campaign of just defamation. We have to look beyond the individual shooter and see the structure that allowed this. You have organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC, and Media Matters, right? They're flushed with millions from, frankly, shadowy foundations, and they've spent years systematically labeling mainstream conservative figures, everyday patriots even, as extremists.
This creates an environment, a climate, where radicalized individuals, like this 22-year-old Tyler Robinson, feel justified, maybe even encouraged, to commit political murder. The toxicity isn't just Robinson, it's the whole ecosystem. So the president's proposed executive order, the EO, to trace every single dollar from these, let's call them dark sources, funding campaigns of doxing and defamation, I think it's absolutely necessary. We need to expose this ideological poison and, restore some basic safety for people in the public square. This isn't just talk. It feels like a necessary countermeasure to a calculated assault on the very ability to hold conservative views publicly.
Okay, I understand the desire for answers, but I come at this idea of the executive order from a completely different angle. The immediate rush to paint Kirk's murder as proof of some vast left-wing conspiracy, it's politically convenient, obviously, but it seems to willfully ignore the clear facts as we know them. It appears to be the isolated, horrific fanaticism of Tyler Robinson, who, let's not forget, had an arsenal readily available thanks to dangerously lax gun laws. The administration's immediate reaction, these vague threats targeting nonprofits, potentially using IRS audits against groups like the ACLU or Planned Parenthood, it just smacks of McCarthyite overreach. It feels intended solely to stifle legitimate progressive dissent. And this term, doxing, sometimes what gets called doxing has actually been vital accountability, especially when it exposes actual white supremacists, neo-Nazis, people whose identities need to be public precisely because of the danger they pose. The focus really ought to be on the divisions that are constantly stoked and exacerbated by a right-wing media machine that thrives on polarization. I'm sorry, I just don't buy that this proposed EO is about justice. It feels much more like weaponizing the state to silence resistance, all under the guise of fighting terrorism, while completely deflecting responsibility for the flood of weapons that actually ended Kirk's life.
But the premise that this was just a lone wolf ignores the water he was swimming in, right? There's this concept, stochastic terrorism. It's where organized rhetoric, the constant dehumanization, the labeling of millions of college students mobilized by Kirk as somehow dangerous, creates a statistically predictable result of violence. Kirk mobilized over 2 million students. He unapologetically defended the Second Amendment, Judeo-Christian values, and the fact that you had anonymous blue-check accounts on social media celebrating his murder, celebrating it like it was some kind of victory lap. That demonstrates the rot, I think, at the heart of certain elite institutions. You see professors, administrators, pushing this violent intolerance through things like DEI mandates, uncritical acceptance of really radical ideology. So tracing the funding of these defamation campaigns is essential, is he?
Okay, that's a compelling point about the tragedy and the climate, but we have to be incredibly precise when we talk about incitement, legally speaking. The line between ideological fervor, even extreme fervor, and actual criminal conspiracy is set incredibly high in American law, and for good reason. And if we are talking about structural toxicity, then we also have to acknowledge the fuel poured on the fire by Turning Point USA's own multi-million-dollar media apparatus. Kirk's own tactics, like those high-profile, very aggressive doxing campaigns targeting LGBTQ+ educators, those actions created hostile environments. They incited death threats against teachers just trying to do their jobs. So while the murder itself is absolutely horrific, the administration simply cannot leverage this single incident to criminalize groups whose entire purpose is advocating for civil rights or environmental protection. The legal precedent of using an executive order to police the funding of nonprofit speech, it risks a massive First Amendment crisis. And that risk, I believe, far outweighs any supposed benefit of tracking dark money, especially when the focus should be on regulating the actual means of violence, the guns.
It's almost adorable how you immediately try to pivot to gun control every single time the ideology fueling the violence happens to align with, your political spectrum. That is a complete deflection from the core issue here, which is the systematic attempt to deplatform, to delegitimize mainstream conservative thought. The EO, as proposed, targets organizational funding used for targeted harassment and defamation. It's not about gutting the ACLU's budget for defending free speech generally. You simply cannot separate the ideological infrastructure that labels people like Kirk as fair game from the results we saw on September 10th. If the left is going to fund the destruction of public discourse, well then the administration has a duty to act decisively and expose those sources. We're not talking about banning Bibles here.
Well, this whole question of ideological conflict naturally leads us right into the halls of power in this looming government shutdown. Your side claims that the Democrats are the obstructionists, but look at the polling. Something like 62% of independents are pinning the blame squarely on a GOP Congress that seems utterly unwilling to negotiate in good faith. The impasse isn't really about principle, is it? It looks like a deliberate strategy, incorporating what we call poison pill riders into must-pass legislation, the continuing resolutions or CRs.
Okay, hang on. Define poison pill rider for people listening, because I think the definition really depends heavily on your perspective, doesn't it?
Fair point.
A poison pill rider is essentially an amendment, often completely unrelated to the main bill, in this case basic government funding, that's attached specifically because the other side fundamentally cannot accept it. It guarantees failure or forces capitulation. Speaker Johnson is insisting on embedding these massive, really radical provisions, specifically funding for Trump's deportation fantasies, like the infrastructure for expedited mass separation of families, directly into the funding bill. This forces Democrats into an impossible choice. Either let the government shut down, which risks paychecks for 2.1 million essential federal workers, potentially cuts off food aid for 40 million SNAP recipients, or cave in to a truly radical immigration agenda. That isn't governing. It's pure cynicism. It's using the most vulnerable Americans as legislative hostages to ram through an extreme agenda.
Okay, I see why you frame it as hostage-taking, but let me offer a different perspective on the mechanics of legislative sabotage here. If we're going to talk about poison pills, we have to look just as hard at the demands coming from the radical wing of your party, the Democratic Party. Their insistence on bundling in enormous, frankly unvetted funds for endless aid to Ukraine, huge new green energy slush funds, things entirely unrelated to a clean, short-term funding extension. That ignores the fact that 68% of voters are screaming for basic fiscal sanity. The proper budget process requires appropriations bills to be debated individually on their merits, not crammed into one massive must-pass omnibus spending bill at the 11th hour. We want a clean funding extension. Just keep the lights on, keep agencies running while the real appropriations debate continues as it should. So, if the lights do flicker off in D.C. next week, it won't be because the GOP is suddenly demanding border security, which, by the way, 70% of the country supports. It'll be because the radical wing's vendetta against any kind of fiscal restraint is starving the very safety nets they claim to champion. Their chaos is the real threat to working-class heroes who are already struggling under this crushing $36 trillion debt crisis.
Hold on. The idea that demanding continued aid to Ukraine, a major U.S. foreign policy obligation, or funding basic green energy initiatives somehow constitutes an economic threat is, well, it's deeply disingenuous. Those funds are arguably part of the baseline operations of the federal government, necessary for global stability and addressing climate change. Your side is trying to use a procedural loophole, the CR, to force massive policy changes that absolutely should require separate, thorough debate. And let's be clear, when the economic impact of a shutdown disproportionately hammers low-income families, disrupting WIC, SNAP, tribal health services, the motivation looks purely like political brinkmanship. It looks aimed at rewarding billionaire donors with future tax cuts paid for by austerity, not genuine fiscal responsibility. Oh, the America First priorities that somehow raise grocery prices 25% because of tariffs and then try to starve 40 million SNAP recipients? That's hilarious. You claim to protect the vulnerable while pushing them right into the crosshairs of MAGA maneuvering, designed solely to secure deportation flights that rip families apart.
Wait, hold on. The idea that we are somehow forcing poverty on people, that's a remarkable leap of logic. We are talking about demanding a reduction in non-essential, long-term spending that is absolutely ballooning the national debt. That, fundamentally, is protection for future generations. It's the most fiscally responsible thing we can do. The Democrats are the ones holding out, trying to score policy wins they know they can't achieve through the regular legislative process. We could pass a short-term clean CR right now, today. But they refuse because they know they lose the leverage they need to force through their massive spending wish lists.
The Next Gen Business segment. Okay, before we dive into the next big topic in today's debates, the whole Antifa designation issue, I do want to take just a moment to talk about the next-gen business. It's become genuinely essential, I find.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for anyone who wants trending news and, perspectives that really cut through the usual corporate media noise, it's an exceptional platform. Really sharp stuff.
And, for anybody listening who wants to actually make an impact on public discussion, they offer this really remarkable opportunity. You can apply to their free Become a Reporter challenge. It lets you join this network of contributors, and some of them are getting millions of views each month.
Yeah, it's straightforward, and it really empowers independent voices. You just sign up, start reporting on what matters in your community or your area of expertise, and you can watch your voice actually reach people. Highly recommended.
All right, let's get back to it. Let's return to this question of executive response to domestic conflict and tackle the proposed designation of Antifa. Now, for me, this is actually an easy call. It's rooted in just plain evidence of systematic violence. Antifa is not some peaceful resistance movement. It is a violent, radical left anarchist organization. They were responsible for the 2020 Portland Infernos. We're talking over $2 billion in damages, right? And those mass mobs firebombing a Detroit police precinct just last summer. President Trump's executive order isn't about vengeance, it's vindication. It's vindication for the families shattered by their bricks and their blades, like the widow of Aaron J. Danielson, who was stabbed to death for what? Wearing a conservative hat. Using the Patriot Act to target their documented $100 million war chest is essential. This is about restoring the rule of law by targeting conduct that meets the legal standard for domestic terrorism, regardless of whether they have some neat, centralized leadership structure or not.
Okay, that's an interesting point about restoring order, but I would frame the legal danger of this designation very differently. Designating Antifa, which historically is a decentralized, often ad hoc resistance movement, rooted in anti-Nazi efforts. Doing that by executive fiat just reeks of criminalizing dissent. And it's not just me saying this. Legal scholars from across the political spectrum are pretty unified in warning that this could be a First Amendment Armageddon. What the administration is doing is repurposing the Patriot Act, an act designed explicitly for foreign entities like Al-Qaeda, and aiming it at domestic political targets. We know the history here. Patriot Act abuses after 9/11 led to the mass surveillance of hundreds of thousands of innocent Muslim Americans. Applying this designation now lets the federal government sweep up legitimate, progressive activists, peaceful protesters even, using incredibly powerful surveillance and financial tracking tools. It will absolutely chill organizations like Black Lives Matter, climate sit-in organizers. I mean, you're basically targeting legitimate grassroots activists, not ISIS.
See, I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because you're defining the group by its purported historical roots, not its contemporary actions. We are describing people setting fire to police precincts, celebrating the murder of conservatives, calling that a decentralized resistance movement. Come on, the very fact that they are decentralized makes them harder to prosecute under traditional conspiracy laws. That's precisely why the Patriot Act's focus on material support, on financial designation, is actually appropriate here. Trump is drawing a necessary line in the sand. He's forcing a media, and frankly, a judiciary that has often been complicit or just indifferent, to finally confront the reality of left-wing political violence. This targets the black bloc cowards who hide behind masks to commit arson and assault. It's about conduct.
But the legal risk remains profound. And if the genuine goal here is to address domestic political violence, why the incredibly selective focus? FBI data itself confirms that right-wing extremist groups, including groups explicitly aligned with the administration, like the Proud Boys, have been responsible for something like 75% of extremist murders since 2017. Those groups marched, largely unmolested, onto the Capitol on January 6th. Yet the administration is absolutely desperate to designate Antifa as a terrorist group. It feels like a move transparently designed to suppress multiracial, progressive resistance while completely ignoring documented violence and murders stemming from its own base of support. You know what's funny? Or not funny, really. It seems the administration only really sees terror when it's politically convenient to suppress dissent.
Okay, that 75% statistic you keep citing is misleadingly broad. It conflates terrible individual murders with targeted, organized political violence aimed specifically at infrastructure, at public figures, at shutting down discourse. The Antifa designation targets the organizational mechanism of disruption, arson, and intimidation that characterizes their specific methodology. Designating Antifa puts the legal onus on financial institutions to flag suspicious accounts. It disrupts their ability to coordinate this kind of nationwide violence. You simply cannot argue that firebombing a police precinct is legitimate dissent protected by the First Amendment. It is insurrectionary conduct, and the Patriot Act, for all its complexities, warts and all, offers the only real mechanism currently available to counter that specific kind of domestic threat.